Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome back to Summit. Some of you have been with us for this summit for the duration of the day, and we're so grateful. This is our next panel, which is unlearning and relearning to create the beloved community, or to unlearning and new learning for a beloved community mindset. So I want you to, if you've been with us, to go ahead and drop wherever you're watching and YouTube comments, Facebook, Twitter, send out a tweet, uh, drop in the comments under the live stream that you're watching on Facebook, put in the comments on YouTube. What are your thoughts about this summit so far? And did you catch the three tangible outcomes we wanted you to have to commit to cultivating a beloved community mindset? To commit to broadening your loyalty, to commit to organizing via partnerships and coalitions. This is how we will cultivate a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. Listen, we just don't want to change our thinking. We want to change it toward good. We just don't want to cultivate a different mindset. We want to cultivate a beloved community mindset and then go and create the beloved community. I'm excited about this theme for the year for the King Center. It starts with me cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. And I just want to lead us into this next conversation. I want you first, though, to share wherever you're watching from today, whatever platforms you're on. Go ahead and retweet this broadcast on Twitter, share it on Facebook, copy the link for it on YouTube, and share it with family and friends. Let's keep it together. Let's get other people engaged and involved. And listen, do this. Tweet out some great quotes that you heard, something that inspired you. Use the hashtag BCGS. Use hashtag transform unjust systems. And then finally, hashtag beloved community mindset and tag at the King Center. We want everybody to be a part of this. This is the third annual Beloved Community Global Summit. This panel, Unlearning and New Learning for a Beloved Community Mindset, is so important. I tell you why. Because we all have stuff that we need to get rid of. Dr. Bernice A. King, our CEO at the King Center, calls it, she talked about weeds this morning in one of the conversations, how we have some stuff to dig out and then some stuff to put back. So we have to unlearn, and then we need to have some new learning for a beloved community mindset. And I have some powerful, great, phenomenal people who will join me for this conversation. I'm probably going to let them do most of the talking because they're out there doing this powerful work for a community. I want to bring on first Shane Claiborne, who I call now brother and friend, who is a leader of Red Letter Christians. Listen, Shane's work inspires me. From the work he does to combat gun violence, to the work he does to stop people from dying on death row. That's a labor, because you're seeing people and you're talking to people who are about to die, state sanctioned murder. And we know Dr. King talked about the death penalty being the final word that we won't forgive, that we're not willing to move forward in love. So I want to welcome Shane Claiborne from Red Letter Christians, activist, author. Welcome, brother.
Hey, Dr. West, it's so good to be with you. So good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you Saturday.
Hey, I'm all ready. I got my bag packed back there. I'll be there tomorrow.
Ready,
Yep.
you ready? Welcome to this conversation today.
Thank you. I'm
Welcome.
so excited about it.
Wonderful. We also have with us Kazu Haga, who is the founder and coordinator of the East Point Peace Academy. Anytime you put all that together, Peace Academy, I'm ready. So we want to welcome Kazu today. Welcome.
How's it going? It's good to be with you all.
It's good to be with you. How are you today?
I'm doing all right, trying to stay dry in all this rain here in California, but it's sunny right now, so.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. We were to have, I want to have, if Randima's here, have Randy
Yep.
come on. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, hello. Good
Hello,
afternoon. Good
hello.
morning. Yes.
I apologize. They put in the chat room, everybody, but I didn't see your name there. Welcome. Thank you
No
for.
worries.
I haven't met you before. I'm excited about it. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a co-founder at Center for Humane Technology. And so we look at this intersection between technology, society, our minds. There's a lot going on there. You may have seen some of our work in the social dilemma. If you haven't seen it it really helps you understand how social media is kind of distorting our minds, democracy, children, values. It's a kind of a mess. And so, but I think it has a lot to do with how we see each other and how we can kind of reharmonize. So excited to dive into all this with all of you today.
It is, of course, Randy, Kazu, Shane. We'll touch on social media a bit today. It does kind of distort. The first thing I tell my nieces is, you don't know all those folks. She communicates like she knows all of those people. I'm like, they're not, but the Facebook friends is in quotations, you're not really friendly. And there's some things, because it's a great tool. Technology can be a great tool. But Dr. King talked about how we could destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. And
And we
that's
are.
where we are there with that. And we are.
I think
So
we
we
are.
can talk about that a bit today, but thank you, all of you, again, for being with us on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Bernie C. King, who is somewhere interviewing with someone right now. We thank you. We're grateful. This conversation, these panels are intentional. Their purpose to move us forward. We just don't want to talk about something. So we shared some tangible outcomes we want people to take away. And that first tangible outcome, as we talk about unlearning, is that we wanted people to commit to cultivating a beloved community mindset. And Mrs. Coretta Scott King said the beloved community is a realistic vision of an achievable society. She talked about how it's a place where conflict exists. It just depends on how you resolve the conflict. Do you do it peacefully and without bitterness? And of course, she believed that we could do it if we were willing to be educated and trained. She talked about how in the beloved community, that mindset even drives our political policies. Can you imagine that? Where our legislation is driven by love for humanity? Picture, let's all dream. And then commit to the work again of making that happen. We can see that. I believe we can see more of that, create the beloved community in pockets. But I wanted to start out, just by asking each of you, as in your work, I know you may see pity instead of compassionate action. Let's talk for a moment about that. What's the difference, and how can we get to the place where we move from pity? How can we unlearn just a sense of pity and get to the place where we say love? Love is different than pity. So how do we do that in your work? How have you encountered that, and what do you think is possible in us unlearning pity and moving to compassionate action? Start with you, Randy.
Sure. Gosh, there's so much to say. I kind of put some notes together, but one thing I want to add that I think each of us should sort of add something from our work, and the Dr. King said, right, about compassion. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars
Mm-hmm.
needs restructuring. So I want to talk a little bit about the systemic forces that are causing like a lot of this problem that we're in. Because I believe that we have to see these systems clearly, right, before we change them. So there's a lot to say
Mm-hmm.
about how we change them. But in short, we have a situation now where money is at the center of our economic system. So, of course, what's incentivized most is money making, right? And the structures and a lot of the social structures reinforce that. And of
Mm.
course, that reinforces a lot of inequality, right? And it has this systemic property. So what happens is we have our economic system relies on competition, which in theory is supposed to offer better products to people. Sometimes it does that. Mostly, I would argue it doesn't, at least not anymore. The quest to compete leads to extraction. And when you get competition and extraction amplified by technology, right, that is improving exponentially, we erode the foundation of what humans depend on, right? Nature, which we're seeing with the climate crisis, but not just nature, right? Our own shared understanding, our ability to see the same things with the same understanding, the same facts, the same kind of empathy for each other, our attention, our ability to focus on what is important and make wise choices, our values, like being generous or being altruistic, they are being superseded by ideas, very selfish ideas. And so this affects all of us here in the room today, but also future generations.
Mhm.
And so I think this is a big part of what is driving the inability to be compassionate, to be loving
Mm.
in the deep way, right? When you talk about this vision of a world where policy is made lovingly, gosh, you have to look at, like, that's a different system. And so I just wanted to bring that lens, is to understand this system. Well-meaning people get caught in these races, and all of us get caught in some way or another, right? So Facebook, the things we share, right? Everyone's in this subtle competition. LinkedIn, everyone's like humble bragging, right? There's like this humble bragging you have to do. It's all, everyone's playing this game. It happens at work with CEOs of big companies who, they're all accountable, right? To their, people are accountable to their boss, who's accountable to the CEO, who's accountable to the shareholders. And you end up in this system that's driven by growth and greed, even if the people aren't all greedy. So there's something really
Mhm.
interesting to understand there. I'll stop there. I think, there's so many other things I could say, but I think that lens, I just wanted to introduce that.
But you raise a good point, though. I want to kind of frame it for those listening and viewing in the sense of, in order to unlearn the things we need to unlearn to have a beloved community mindset, we have to realize our environment.
Yes.
And in a sense, Shane and Kazu, Randy, it's like we're in the matrix. And you
Yes.
take that right pill and you realize, I've been deceived all this time.
Yes.
And you
But
see
can
everything differently. Sure.
I just add one more sentence, which is with respect to these concepts like interdependence, right? Interdependence is all about understanding the conditions that shape each of us and the people we interact with and the people we may not like, right? That their actions we may
Mm-hmm.
not like.
Yeah.
And I think that these kinds of systems are huge in terms of setting conditions, often from birth, about what we think is right and wrong, what we think our goals should be, all of these things. And they just exacerbate, right, inequality, injustice, and take us away from love and compassion and the things that
Mm-hmm.
we need to solve the problems.
Thank you, Randy. Kazu, what are your thoughts on the realization that we're often living in dynamics that we weren't aware of? And that beloved community mindset, in a real sense, means I have to function in a way totally differently than the community or the world I'm living in. Some people say, like Howard Thurman, when I hear people describe him as a mystic, I think mystic becomes, somebody who totally thinks differently than the conditions that they're in. Kazu and then Shane, share your thoughts on that unlearning by way of realizing that we have to function and think differently than the conditions that we're in.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I want to start by sharing a little bit of my thoughts on the term beloved community, because it's a term that's become more popularized recently,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all over the place. If something becomes popularized, there's a benefit to it because we all want to be talking about beloved community, but there's also a danger in that oftentimes the core essence of these messages get lost. And when I hear people these days talk about beloved community, I oftentimes hear them talking about, oh, well, my beloved community is my church group or my faith
Oh,
or my
yeah.
family, friends group. And to me, those are like loving communities. But when Dr. King talked about beloved community, when Josiah Royce talked about beloved community, they were talking about interdependence, which is a word that we've heard already today. And this idea, like, we live in a very individualistic society, and so to see things in a different way takes a radical shift in the way we view the world. And the idea that we are interdependent, it's like a really nice thing to think about. Oh, my liberation is bound up with your liberation, how
Mm-hmm.
nice that is. And we oftentimes don't realize the gut-wrenching, challenging struggle it is to actually embody that worldview. It's hard work. One of my, I oftentimes start by saying one of my favorite Dr. King quotes is, of which I have like 100. So one of my favorite Dr. King quotes is a very well-known one, when he says, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied
Mm-hmm.
into a
Tied in a
single
single bond of destiny.
that
Mm-hmm.
whatever affects one person directly affects all people indirectly. And I oftentimes wonder how many people really believe that, or whether we believe that the universe it weaves separate webs of interdependence based on our political affiliation, right? And that my liberation is only bound with the liberation of people that I agree with or the people that I look
Mm-hmm.
like. And beloved community interdependence, it's a universal law for me. It's a universal truth. So even if you don't believe it to be so, you're still governed by its laws. So what does it mean for us to step outside of the individualistic worldview that so many of us are conditioned in, and to begin to really believe that my liberation is bound with the liberation of all beings in society, including the people that voted for the other political party, including the person that may have hurt me the most in my life, right?
Mm.
And develop compassion for those people is gut-wrenching work. But it's powerful work, and it is the work that is necessary for our own healing and for the healing of the world. And so I think when we talk about beloved community, we can't forget that it's not just this like beautiful, easy thing, but it's really difficult work that we need to
Right.
get.
It's not a utopia. A lot of people hear it and they think it's a utopia. Or what you're saying, Kazu, is very true. People say I have a beloved community family, but if it doesn't extend beyond your family, the how Josiah Royce and Dr. King and Coretta Scott King and all those who taught us about the beloved community taught it is it becomes a global thing. It spreads. So if I have the beloved community mindset, I can take the beloved community mindset to my workplace, to my school. If I can get other people to have beloved community mindset, then we start to have beloved community schools, and then beloved community universities, and then the beloved communities everywhere. And it's supposed to permeate the globe. But it has become, Kazu and Shane, if you can expound on this, because of our individualistic pursuits, it's often hard for us to even unlearn to have new learning and get a beloved community mindset.
Yeah, I think we are kind of acculturated into thinking certain ways. Like I heard somebody say, some of us were born on third base, but we act like we hit a triple.
Okay,
You know,
Shane, if I could pause just for one moment, I want to bring on Dr. Liz Steele
yeah,
Harris. She's joined
absolutely.
us, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. Liz, come on in.
It's good to be here.
Welcome, welcome. We'll finish up Shane's comment and we'll get over to you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Reverend Liz. 25 years ago, Reverend Liz and I were organizers in our 20s in Philadelphia together. So we go way back, and it's always good to see you. And yeah, Dr. Vanetta, as I was thinking of, the distinction between compassion and justice, that they can go together. They need to go together.
That's good.
We've spent our life in Philly. I mean, just this morning, I'm seeing hundreds of folks getting food that they desperately need. I mean, we're doing that every day, every week. But we've also got to ask why people are hungry. And, when Randy was quoting that wonderful sermon of Dr. King, when he's preaching on the Good Samaritan, and he says, we're all called to, lift our neighbor out of the ditch on the road to Jericho. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, we got to do something about the whole road to Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of my mentors said, kind of quoting the old cliche, said, you give someone a fish to eat for a day, you teach someone to fish to eat for the rest of their life. But he said, we've also got to ask, who owns the pond? And that's kind of the work of justice, right? The work that we are sharing food with folks, but we're also asking why people are hungry. And I think one of the things that we've got to do is stay in touch with those that are suffering. And that's what, the Poor People's Campaign has done so well, to center and amplify the folks that are directly impacted by injustice. And, Mother Teresa, who's been a great inspiration of mine, she said, it can be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to them. And really what we've got to do is stay in relationship with those who are suffering the brunt of these injustices. So we don't just become charity brokers, because you can write a check and not have a relationship. Just like you can give $5 to somebody on the street, precisely because you don't want to have a conversation. But love calls us to do something deeper than just write checks and hand out money and
That
avoid what love requires of us.
it does. That's proximity is what Brian Stevenson calls that. Great founder of Equal Justice Initiative. We need to be in proximity. Dr. Liz, you know about that. The interviews that the Poor People's Campaign shared at the Moral Assembly over the summer. The people who you all had just connected with, who were sharing stories that a lot of people who live in the United States, as this is a global summit, don't know that that type of poverty is happening here in the United States. And it gets back to what Shane said about transforming Jericho Road. How do we do, when we talk about unlearning, I believe one of the main things that we have to unlearn is that charity is all there is. This sense of we just going to give toward a problem instead of saying, why does that problem exist? As Shane mentioned, that's what Dr. King meant when he was talking about transforming Jericho Road. How do we unlearn charity as the main pathway to the beloved community?
It's surely a huge unlearning that our
Mm-hmm.
society needs to go through. And in that quote from Dr. King, I mean, he says, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring, right? And I think that's what we have to be able to show to this society, that kind of transformation needs to happen, and it's possible to happen. I think so often the reason that very well-meaning folk think that charity is the only option is
Mm-hmm.
that we are told that that's the case, and we're told that there's not enough to go around. So the only thing to do is to redistribute a little bit of the excess to
Yeah.
some crumbs to below. But we throw out more food in this country that could feed not just every person that's hungry in this country, but across the world, right? Just in throwing out food, let alone how much food and everything is being produced, right? It takes 45 minutes to build a 3D printed house these days. There are 5 abandoned housing units for every person who is unhoused in this country. And there are, at least 10 million families and people that are living, either in cars or with family or are in some way kind of homeless. But there's 5 abandoned houses in big cities for every homeless person there, right? And yet, right now, the thing that we think is the best to do is a little bit of charity. And so I think some of the unlearning is about actually realizing the true abundance that exists. I think it's looking back at history and seeing how change happens. Does change happen through charity? Sure, we have to meet immediate needs. And if you're not connecting and meeting people's immediate needs, and you're still preaching justice, I have to question that justice. But it's as a step. It's as perhaps even a first step to then a larger transformation, a restructuring of an edifice that produces people needing charity, right? And so then also we have to see that there are policies and programs at hand, ones that work. How can we have had the child tax credit, exist for some months, lift 4 million kids above the poverty line in the United
Poverty.
States, right? And then have, really bipartisan consensus to not extend or expand that. So to send those 4 million families back below the poverty line in the United States. So we have proven programs that we know actually work. They actually lift the load of poverty. They're not charity, right? But then we don't extend them, we don't expand them, we don't hear about them, and so we think that poverty is just inevitable. It might be unfortunate, and the best thing we can do is either pity or punish the poor, and never to imagine that kind of restructuring of an edifice that is producing that kind of poverty, that could be kind of restructured, and we could actually end that kind of deprivation and poverty for everybody across the world. right now we have the resources. We just have to change the moral consciousness and political will.
Let me ask this question, because Dr. Liz mentioned justice and how people have a different definition. What about how we need to unlearn what we think justice is? Kazu, I see you nodding. Randy, what are your thoughts about that unlearning? Because we can share this Kingian. Dr. King had a definition of injustice that I wrestle with every day and I think about. But Kazu, how are we framing justice if it's not changing, transforming systems, and ensuring that people aren't hungry anymore? And I'll tell you, I was thinking about this quote from Desmond Tutu. He talks about we're pulling people out of the river. In essence, he says, now we have to go upstream and find out how they got in there. And I always think some people, they were thrown in. Some people may have fallen in because of some injustice they encountered. But Kazu, Randy, what do we have to do to unlearn justice and then to learn it again, learn it the right way, what justice is and what it looks like?
Yeah, I laugh because I work a lot in the so-called criminal justice system of this country, where the concept of justice is so skewed and conflated with punishment, right? I mean, that's the most common, I think, misunderstanding. And I can go on and on about my thoughts on the prison system, but the sixth principle of Kingian nonviolence is that the universe is on the side of justice.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, when I'm in conversations with them, are like, well, look at all of the injustice in the world. How can you say that the universe is just? And there was a quote that I read from Dr. King once where he talked about justice not necessarily being about what's good, because that's relative, but justice being about what is balance. That the level of violence that we see in our society is a sign that things are out of balance. And so if you see, if you do a Google image search of the word justice, it's the scales of balance that comes up, right? And if you view it in that way, I always feel like every time a young person is killed in the streets of Oakland, that is evidence that the universe is just. Because I look at all of the investments that we collectively make as a society into systems of violence, into systems of injustice, of inequality, right? We invest in guns and violent media and unjust economic systems and the destruction of the environment. And then when the universe gives us the return on those investments and we see violence in our community, we're like, well, what's wrong with the universe? When that's all we've been investing in. To me, it is justice. It is the order of the universe. It is balance, that as long as we invest in systems of injustice, that we see injustice in return. And so I think if we can begin to see it in that way, and in terms of kind of how we see justice in the criminal justice system too, and in response to harm, like we have this tendency to think that if someone causes harm, it tips the scales of justice, of balance. So we need to cause harm to the other person to balance it. But for me, when harm happens, when injustice happens, weight is placed on the side of harm and on the side of injustice. And if we respond to that by causing more harm to the person that committed it, it tips the scale even more to the side of harm and to the side of injustice. And so what we need to do to bring balance and order back into the universe is to put weight onto the side of compassion and the side of understanding. And that's what can balance the scale when harm and injustice happens.
That, before you talk, and I want to say that goes back to the death penalty, Shane. This idea that by causing harm to the person who did harm, we can get justice in place, but it actually perpetuates what Dr. King called a descending spiral of violence.
Yeah,
violence just keeps going. So
yeah. It's absolutely right. And I got off a call earlier right before this one of we had a hybrid vigil because there's an execution that happened today in Oklahoma, the second execution this week in the United States. And some people would call that justice, right? And so I think that's why it's so important to really unpack what we mean, because we can throw that word around. And I would say, brother Dr. Cornell West, he says justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that's a beautiful idea. It's what does love require of us? And in the whole, in the scripture, the word justice is connected to rightness, to righteousness. And it didn't just mean getting what you deserve. It actually meant to set right what was made wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
To heal the wounds that have been inflicted. And that's exactly the opposite of what many of our systems like capital punishment do, right? They just create new wounds. They mirror the evil rather than healing the evil. And my mama taught me 2 wrongs don't make a right,
Mm-hmm.
but we have used this idea that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The best justice we can do is by harming the person back. And I think many of our traditions and Jesus and Dr. King and so many others show us that no, actually, justice is not reciprocating evil.
Mm-hmm.
You transcend evil without mirroring it. And that's what love does. So, I think the real question as we think about justice is, I like to say, what is God's will? For the world, or if that sounds too stale, what is God's dream? And God's dream is not for millions of people to live in poverty while less than 100 people own half the world's assets. Like, that's not
Right.
God's dream. God's dream is not for 100 kids to die every day in America from gun violence. So that might be one way that some of us could think about is, what's God's dream? Like, God's dream is
What
for
is it?
love to prevail.
Yeah. And Randy, Dr. King said also, justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. That sounds, very uh, similar to the work that you're doing in technology and in other spaces. You talk about that for a moment, how we
Yeah,
unlearn this
of course.
idea that justice is revenge and retaliation, and how that applies to the work that you do.
Well, just building on what's been said, I think real compassion and love is hard only because we're not good at it. We don't practice it enough and doing it in the
Mm.
right way, right? Because we're conditioned to doing it in a more selfish way a lot of the time. And so I think it involves, even when we see someone doing something we really don't like, and I'm sort of understating, right? There are many, like abhor, or like there are really harsh versions of that, but that we understand that everyone acts to be happy, right? Every action they take is to be happy, but they believe in that moment to be happy. That horrible act that they did felt like the right thing to do to them at that time. And that's a really difficult thing when it's something that was, for example, against you, against something or a loved one of yours. That's really hard work, I think. So that's, I think, one piece of it that really connects deeply to interdependence and understanding, like the layered nature of conditions, right, and how they shape our minds over time, and they can lead us to very dark places. Um, so I think that's one piece, and then the other piece is, I think justice involves sacrifice for some. Again, back to this idea, right, of like, how do you level it out? Well, some of us, I think a lot of us will have some form of like giving up to do. Some have more than others to give up, but that's really important. And a
Mm.
lot of times that is the piece nobody likes to talk about. And this is coming back to this idea of how beloved or loving has been hijacked, right? This idea that's already mentioned. Um, because no one likes to talk about that aspect of it, right? They sort of always want to talk about, what are we getting? What are we gaining? How are we growing? And there's this like difficult thing of like, actually you grow personally by giving up things, right? And this also connects to the point about charity, right? Charity, I think real generosity involves a measure of giving up something that you're attached to, not just giving the thing that's very easy. And I think those are all difficult things for many of us to do well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about unlearning uh, charity as the main path to the beloved community, and then unlearning what we thought justice is. Let's talk for a few minutes about unlearning sectionalism, because the way we've grouped ourselves off has become much more problematic than it has been even in the past, and not just according to race, but nationalism. There's a movie with I believe it's Chris Rock, where he's running for office, and he says, every time I think it's his opponent that says every time he ends his speech, he says, "God bless America," and nowhere else. And I laugh every time I watch it because I think, wow, it's satire. But what it's really saying to me is often in terms of our nationalities, we might not think we're saying that, but our actions denote the prayers that we do with our feet and our hands and our policies say, we believe we that God is blessing America or God is blessing any nation and nowhere else. How do we deal with and unlearn nationalism, division based on religion? How do you posture? Nonviolence has helped me, and of course at the King Center we dig into that, because when you get into those principles and you start saying, the universe is on the side of justice. As Principle 3 says, I want to defeat evil and injustice and not people. And in Principle 2, I choose to win friendship and understanding, and nonviolence is the way. That's rough stuff. You start living that, unearned suffering is redemptive. It can educate and transform. It's like, really? I'm gonna choose love instead of hate. I believe that's the way. But what are your thoughts, Dr. Liz, Kazu, all you, Shane, Randy? What are your thoughts on how we unlearn sectionalism?
Well, I think I think we've learned it, and it's been enforced on us, pushed on us. I think much of the division that exists in our society isn't just our personal individual decisions.
Right.
It's that systemic racism. It's systemic queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia, you know, uh, uh, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and I think if we look at it that way, then some significant structural changes have to take place for us to be able to undo this kind of division. But again, if we lean on Dr. King, especially those last years, when he's talking about that the Achilles heel of a system, a global system that is racist and anti-poor and pro-war, is to unite and organize those that are most impacted across all of these lines of division. And if we actually, use that as a North Star, if we use that as a pulling point, as what we're, the prize that we're keeping our eyes on, of just actually what does it look like when we unite across these differences, and that is happening all over the place. I mean, when I spend time in Harlan County, Kentucky, or was out with striking nurses in the Bronx yesterday, across race, across age, across religion, across nationalities. I mean, so many different folks. There's a real power there, and so. But I think for us to think that it's going to be just us kind of coming together and not pushing up against some formidable forces that actually are trying to divide, and are trying to pit us against each other, and are selling us these lies that either we can do it ourselves, or the best, or the others are the worst. We have to consciously push against that and push forward, structural and policy changes to respond to that. And we have to build real bridges across these real borders and barriers, especially when it comes to kind of global outreach and global work. Because again, right now there's mostly, especially when it comes to folks in the United States, so often this kind of U.S. exceptionalism that I think gets so much in the way of real global partnership.
Thank you, Shane.
I think of that line of Mother Teresa where she said, sometimes our biggest problem is the circle that we draw around our family is just too small. And it's not that the love for our own family is bad. It's just that our love has got to be bigger than that, bigger than biology, bigger than ethnicity, bigger than nationalism, right? And this is where, as a Christian, it baffles my mind, because I know, there's probably people of all different faiths or no faith that are listening. But as a Christian, we got this idea that we're born again. And ironically, Jesus had some really hard things to say about family and said, you're not ready to be my disciple unless you're born again. And I think what he's challenging is this idea that we belong to each other, right? It's not just about biology. If someone's suffering on the other side of the border, it's as tragic as if it were your own grandmother or your own baby. So that's the problem, I think, is sometimes we just get so caught up in ourselves or the people that we're most comfortable around, or that's the problem with nationalism is it's just too small. That the Bible doesn't say for God so loved America. It says God so loved the world, and we need to love with that global beloved love. That's what we're after.
True. Go ahead, Kazu, Randy.
Yeah. I was thinking about how, as someone who was born and socialized a male, there are certain aspects of myself that I've had to learn to section off, right? Like just the entire wealth of emotions that I'm feeling throughout the day. As someone who grew up with a lot of like childhood traumatic incidents, a lot of my pain from my early childhood I've sectioned off. And so even within my own body, there are pieces of myself that are not integrated. And as long as I'm not integrated, it's harder for me to imagine integrating with the rest of humanity and the rest of the globe. And
Wow.
so I think one of the things that I've really realized is that the more I'm able to do my own personal healing work, and that the more I'm able to build beloved community even just within my own body, the easier it becomes for me to slow down and listen to other people's stories and feel like that's not a threat, even if I disagree with it. I have this
Yeah.
theory that if we can slow down enough to hear another person's story, then everything they do makes sense. And it doesn't mean that everything they do is justified or is right or I condone it, but it begins to make sense why people do the things that they do and believe the things that they do. Working with incarcerated communities, I've talked to hundreds of people who have committed some of the worst forms of harm we can commit against each other as human beings. And when you sit down and listen to their stories, it becomes so easy to be like, oh, I get it. It was wrong what you did, and I get it. It makes sense to me, and it becomes easier for me to have compassion for them. And so I think the importance of doing our own work so that we can slow down and honor each person's stories and really listen to really understand who they are, I think can really help us get beyond that sort of sectionalism that you talk about.
We're hearing some ways to unlearn. Thank you each for sharing that, Randy. Yeah.
Just adding to what folks have said, in psychology, there's this thing called fundamental attribution error, right? And this is actually a cognitive thing that we do wrong. We tend to attribute people's behavior to their personality instead of to their conditions, right? We put too much because we don't know, and we just tend, when in a situation where we don't know, we tend to assume someone who does something we don't like is an ass. And that's obviously not the right thing to do, right? And of course, we're very generous to ourselves about that. If we cut someone else off, we say, oh gosh, we're in such a rush. We are late today. This is really important. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done that. Someone cuts you off.
Right.
It doesn't work like that, right? So I think looking for that, and all of us are getting better at just saying, hey, this is a thing humans do. We've got to find when we do that, and especially without groups, right? Groups that are not familiar to us. That's a huge one. And the other thing is, before we try to depolarize or solve political problems, we have to rehumanize, right? If you see someone else as less than human, you really can't begin, even in a reasonable way, to depolarize. So I think, again, just building on what's been said, that's just critical.
You each have shared so much. Can you believe this discussion is almost over? Uh, no, really, I think, we don't talk about these things enough because sometimes we get in that space where we say we need to stop talking and act. But you actually, without having these conversations, it's like act to do what? Because you can go out and say you're doing justice work and it's harmful work. If we don't investigate why we do this, how we do this, the love we need to do it with, how we actually need to be invited to do this in some communities. We just don't want to go in and say, hey, I hear you're struggling with this over here. I've come to help. And nobody asks us for help. And so just thinking about all those different layers, we've talked about unlearning, just charity and getting into justice, and then also unlearning what we thought justice is. I want each of you to leave the viewers and the watchers today with just one action step, one thing. It can be one word that you believe we can do to get into some new learning, or just share one thing you believe we need to learn, a new learning for humanity, something that we're not grasping collectively that you believe, just in one word as we close out, that we need to learn as human beings. This is a global community. I think that if we could get everybody to read that World House chapter of Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, it would be so powerful. And if we could digest it, but thinking about that concept, World House, what's one thing that each of you would share that you believe would be new learning for humanity collectively? A new learn. All of us are like,
It's a bold request.
yeah.
I'll share a simple thing that isn't as bold as what you said, but maybe the fact that compassion and loving kindness, right? In Buddhism, we have this practice called loving kindness, needs to be practiced. So maybe the next time you're in a train or in a restaurant, look at people and look at them with the eyes of a loved one, like they are a loved one. Just practice that. It is really effective, and it softens your heart to all kinds of people, different ages that you may not normally connect with the same way.
Yeah,
That's a
Dr.
new learning.
Vanetta.
It has
Yeah.
to be practiced. I want people to make note of this. What we're doing, you have to practice these things until we get them. With this, you're talking about changing our thinking
Yeah.
and our mindset, cultivating a beloved community mindset. We got to put some practice in. Shane?
Yeah, just to related to that is I think we've got to continually denounce self-righteousness. And I think Dr. King does that so well, to say that in the face of the oppressed, we can see our own face, but in the hands of the oppressor, we can see our own hands, and to move forward with a little humility. And because I think that self-righteousness becomes really toxic to our souls, and it stops us from being able to believe that someone else can be different than who they are right now.
That's a new learning today, to believe in the power of change. Because I hear people all the time say that person can't change, that community can't change. I say, well, I need to throw out my whole faith and everything, because if change can't happen, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Because change has happened for me. There are things I did 10 years ago. If Twitter would have been around 20 years ago, I'd be in a world of trouble if people went back searching through my tweets. Uh, because there's stuff I believed 20 years ago that I don't believe now, that I can't believe I ever believed it. So thank you for that. Kazu.
Yeah, we've all been there. I'll just leave you all with one of my favorite quotes from Sobonfu Somé, who once said that conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen, and to try to use every conflict in our lives as a gift to be able to deepen in relationship with people.
Now that's Kingian, because Dr. King said there's nothing wrong with tension. That creative tension. That's a new learning, everyone, if you're tuning in, because we sometimes shun tension, but creative tension, conflict can get us to justice and to love. That's a new learn. Thank you for that. Dr. Liz.
So I think we need to realize the power of the people, but especially the people that are most impacted by injustice. To be, to see people's plight, their fight, and also learn their insight. In the words of Frederick Douglass, those who would be free themselves must strike the first blow. And I think we all have a role to play. We need to build something huge and across all these lines. But we have to see that those who are trying to free themselves can lead the whole society to liberation.
And that's King. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. That's a new learning for a whole lot of people, because often we think that those who are in poverty, grappling with injustices, are helpless. But actually, that's where the power rises, from the people who are dealing with it. I'm so grateful for each of you. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Kazu. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Dr. Liz. Thank you for joining the King Center today for this panel.
Thank you.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.